All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I don't see anybody else in the waiting room. Thank you all for joining us for our water cooler chat. What is 4DE and what do you want to know about it? Just some quick reminders about the rules of our water cooler chat process. It's an informal discussion, and we hope to have all ideas and experiences shared among the chat. If you do want to join the conversation, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can click on the participants list and then raise your little blue hand. We do ask that because there are so many people in the chat that you keep your mic muted until we call upon you. But you can also include your comments in the chat box and the host and myself will be monitoring that regularly. And as I mentioned before, if you're just joining us, we are recording today's event. So if you do not want yourself on camera, you can turn your camera off and you can change your name by clicking on the 3 dots in the top right-hand corner of your camera. Okay, with that being said, I have the esteemed pleasure to introduce you to our guest host today, George Mittendorf, who is, sorry, I'm hiding the bio so I can't see it. There you go. George Middendorf, who has a PhD in zoology from the University of Tennessee. He did his postdoc at the University of Iowa, and he is a faculty member at Howard University, where he is currently a professor of the Department of Biology. He focuses on population ecology of spiny lizards, and he also does research on urban neighborhoods surrounding Howard University. Not only is George done a variety of biology courses, developed a number of interdisciplinary courses, and most recently has helped develop and implement the College of Arts and Sciences Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies program. He also is on the board of directors and the co-PI of Includes Ecology Plus, and he is the chair of the 4DE subcommittee. In addition, we have Luanna Prevost. Luanna is an associate professor at the Department of Integrative Biology at University of South Florida. She obtained her PhD in plant biology from the University of Georgia and completed a postdoc at the Michigan State University. Her research focuses on assessment of student learning, professional development, institutional change. She's also interested in how professional development program design can be used to support students in STEM, particularly those from traditionally underserved populations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to George and Luanna, and you all are free to take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm really pleased that Luanna is here. So as chair and incoming chair for the 4DEE subcommittee, we'd like to talk with you about the 4DEE approach and where we came from and where we might be going. And we're going to ask your help today in discussing some ideas and bringing new ideas to us for the committee to consider. But before what I'm going to do is present a little bit of the history of the 4DEE. It's a little difficult, 4DEE approach and where it came from. But before I do that, what I want to do is just indicate that there are a lot of people who've been involved in this effort over the years. And I think I'd like to pay homage. And so I'm going to give you the names, and I'm going to do it in reverse alphabetical order just for a change of pace. And so I want to thank the following individuals for their help. And if I miss somebody, please let me know in the chat box, and I will correct that later and apologize profusely as well. But so let me go through the names: Carolyn Thomas, Pamela Templer, Amanda Sorensen, Vicki Rogers, Julie Reynolds, Bill Reiners, Luanna Prevost, Bob Pollard, Nalini Nancardi, Teresa Murad, Diane Ebert May, Ken Klimo, Jessica Johnson, Jennifer Doherty, Carmen Sid, Kim Biorgo Thorne, Betsy Bancroft, and Alan Berkowitz. This is an esteemed and really great group to work with, and I've had the distinct pleasure of working with many of them for many years, but a lot of them in recent years on this effort. So what is 4DEE and where did it come from? Well, 4DEE is really an attempt to put ecology into a larger context. And it's to look at ecology in 4 dimensions. And the dimensions include kind of core ecological concepts. These are the ones with which you're all familiar. And it's the ones that we teach in, your standard ecological classroom. But we also recognize there's another dimension, and that dimension is the dimension of ecology practices. In other words, what are the practices that you use in doing ecology? And then the third dimension is this human environment interaction, which includes consideration of our relationship with the environment, both our dependence on and our effect on the environment. And the fourth dimension is the cross-cutting themes. And this effort really goes back, well over 30 years, but we kind of date it to 1986, when the past president then, Paul Risser, focused on the idea of eco-literacy in his past president's address. And he talked about the need for the lay public to be able to comprehend selected disciplinary constructs, the terminology and the concepts that were used and were needed in order to make public policy. So Risser really focused the society's attention on this idea of using ecology in a public policy forum. And he focused it by saying there was a need for a broad understanding of the terminology and concepts by the public, and for its use, ecology's use in making policy and solving public problems. After Risser gave that talk, there were a number of papers. The first off, Ken Klimo's 1991, where he talked about concepts, or in 1992, Alan Berkowitz and others in 97 and 2005, and then McBride in 2011, 2012. And then, ironically enough, Paul Risser died in the summer of 2014. And I guess he must have been on our minds when we met members of the Committee on Diversity and Education. We have an annual meeting in the fall, and we met that fall, and a group of us, Carmen Sid, Ken Klimo, myself, Bob Pollard, and Carolyn Thomas, sat down and said that we needed to go back and revisit Paul Risser's work, and we needed to consider how ecology fit into the larger public sphere. And we recognized that there was a need to include ecology in the fundamental biology curriculum. We needed to justify, in part, the allocation of departmental and university resources to ecology. This was, for those of you who lived through it, a time when there was a lot of tension between whether biology should go a medical route or go a cell and molecular route and leave ecology alone, and departments were splitting. And we thought that if you wanted to maintain departments, you needed to justify ecology. You needed to justify the fact that you needed to take students out in the field. You needed to figure out how to get the administration to pay attention to ecology and the environment. And the third piece was, interestingly enough, we had professional certification, and the certification process was asking for guidelines as to what ecologists needed to know and when they needed to know it for professional certification. A number of other institutions, professional societies, had come up with disciplinary-based professional certification and conceptual frameworks, and they included the American Chemical Society, the American Society for Microbiology, the British Ecological Society, and we didn't want to get too far behind them. And we thought we should address this and put together some concepts. And so in 2016, we submitted a long-range planning grant. We got together and met. We put together a proposal to establish this fundamental framework, and we gave the proposal to the governing board of the Ecological Society. And in November of 2018, they voted unanimously to endorse the framework and establish the committee, the 4DEE subcommittee. And the committee has been working, as you know, or may know, to both promulgate and to aid the implementation of these 4 dimensions into the ecological curriculum. And so we're meeting here today to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing and to talk a little bit more about some of the work that we hope to do. And so Luanna will now tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, George. So it's good to see so many faces, icons, and names today. So the 4DE subcommittee is a group of 9 people who have participated in the development and improvement of the framework, and we are trying to guide the course of the 4DE implementation and also its improvement, but we always want feedback from the community. So that's why we are happy that you can join us here today so we can hear from you. What have you heard? Are you using the framework? And what challenges do you face? So right now the committee is setting up working groups. So for instance, there are several areas where we think that we could extend more investigation into the framework. For instance, looking at how do we teach ecology to non-majors? What parts of the framework do we emphasize? How do we integrate parts of the frameworks for non-majors, for example? We are also doing currently a lot of work on assessment. So how do you design assessments that reflect what students can know and do because you've used the framework in your course design? So there's a lot of research now from the, for example, we have the NGSS, Next Generation Science Standards that focus on the different dimensions of instruction and assessment in the K-12 arena. And then we have Vision and Change, which looks at practices as well as, or in this case, competencies and core concepts for biology. So we are looking at this multidimensional approach that is being more and more the focus of how do we teach. So this requires integration. So how do we use this integration for not only design, but also for assessment? Some of the activities that we've been participating in is, well, one of them is getting the word out via ESA venues. So for example, we've held some workshops on assessment. In last summer, when we all moved to the virtual space, we held an extravaganza where we talked about how do you implement the framework, how do you assess your coursework and evaluate whether you are integrating, including multiple dimensions, how can you build activities that bring this lens to your classroom. And we're continuing to do this in this coming ESA meeting in 2021. We also host some organized oral sessions and hopefully some workshops that can help guide your implementation of the framework. So today we wanted to ask for your ideas. So before we get into the full discussion, I want to do a little informal polling. So if you look to the right, lower right hand of your screen, you should see the reactions. So we love to hear whether you have heard of 4DEE before this and if you are using it. So if this is your first time using 4DEE, can you use the surprise face reaction? If this is something you've heard of before but haven't yet implemented, we'd love to see a thumbs up. And if you are already using 4DEE, then we'd love for you to show us with a clap. So let's see where everybody is. So I see some surprise faces, which is great. New people, some thumbs up, a couple claps. All right. So it seems that we have a very diverse audience as far as 4DEE use. So one of the things we would like is, oh, and we're getting some responses in the chat. Love it, yes. So yeah, so one of the things we like, because we have a lot of new people, is to ask what brought you to this water cooler chat, and why is 4DEE of interest to you? And then to those who have heard of it before and are using it or not yet using it, what challenges do you face? So with that, I would like to open up the discussion. We have some 4DEE gurus with us who've been along for the journey. I see Bob, I see Carmen. So we have a lot of people with different levels of experience, and we'd love to hear from all of you. So we can start with what interests you about 4DEE? Okay, so we have using it in non-majors. Interdisciplinary dissertation. Oh, wonderful. So a lot of 4DE works on integration, where we include the human dimensions, as George mentioned. So that's a really cool idea. We're looking for new ideas and approaches. We also want to welcome you to raise your hand if you want to contribute verbally and not just to the chat. So we will open it up for to hear other voices as well. Okay, so we have a lot of people who are interested in research and teaching as well. So implementing 4DEE in the classroom, teaching methodologies and approaches, revamping as a response to the pandemic, non-majors and assessment, improving the course and implementing it in the classroom, integrating the socio-environment dimensions, such as climate justice, environmental justice. Exactly, okay.
Luanna, how would you like to start? We're getting some really great responses here, but they're kind of, they're different areas. Maybe we can touch on one and just talk a little bit about it and then switch over after a bit. Personally, let me offer, the first comment was on non-majors, and this is an area that I'm particularly interested in. In fact, Jessica and Vicki Rogers and I have been talking a lot recently about how do you work with non-majors and how do you bring in ecology and the other dimensions. And one of the things that we recognized is that that's a really interesting area because it's not quite in ecology, but it uses ecology. And so, for instance, when you're teaching a non-majors course, you're not teaching ecologists, you're teaching students a little bit of ecology, and they're bringing in their own disciplinary practices. So I teach a course called Science and Public Policy. It's a team taught course with a political scientist. And the disciplinary practices in political science are really quite different. Most of it's historical. It uses computers and databases in a way that we don't, and they don't go out in the field much. And they certainly don't take measurements of tree diameter at breast height or anything like that at all. That's not what they do, but they do use maps and they do look at socioeconomic data and they do look at impacts of people in different areas. And so we've been able to kind of blend the two discipline areas and consider, say, for instance, environmental differences in different communities. And so in Washington, DC, we can look and work in different communities in Washington and look at the tree cover. We can look at the socioeconomic data. We can look at the gardens. We can look at the insects and birds. We can look at the difference in air quality, et cetera. And all of those relate in kind of profound and yet and not unexpected ways to the socioeconomics of the particular area. And then again, in terms of history, those often relate back to historical decisions, redlining, apartheid, segregation, and in Washington, DC, which was a Southern essentially a southern state or district. So there's a history there, there's politics there, there are decisions, there are economic decisions, there are housing decisions and lending decisions, all play a role in determining the kind of environment different people live in, and then the impact of that environment on the people who live there. So my students, some of my students have gone out and looked at air pollution and found that in African-American communities near Washington, D.C., the air quality is not nearly as nice as crosstown in Northwest Washington, which is largely populated by white people. So, and those have profound differences, and they relate to the trees and the abundance of trees and the cover of trees. So what we're doing is collecting ecological data and then looking at how it relates to humans. And for non-majors, I think the key there is to recognize that this is not necessarily an audience of ecologists, but it's an audience who have interest in environmental and ecological aspects as they relate to their own discipline. Does anybody out there, perfect question, Jessica, anyone out there teaching non-majors? Put your hand up, right in the chat box. Talk to us. Zakia, oh, a familiar name, and Mary Beth and Ann Mayo, excellent. Would you like to share what you're trying to do with your class? And maybe tell us something about a barrier to implementing 4DEE.
So I'll say something about that because I'm really interested in this. This is our second semester for the non-majors, and we have a whole unit on ecology. So we do cover that in the classroom. We do basic introduction to trophic, food webs, that kind of stuff, and community ecology, et cetera. But what I'm really concerned about is how to get them involved in labs. And the issue is a lot of our stuff is now online. So while we could go off on our campus a little bit, and I'm at a 2-year school, so we don't have advanced courses for many things anyway, but we could normally go outside together and do some of the things that you're talking about, but now we really can't because of the COVID. But I really want to kind of make this more, I guess, a stronger section on ecology, both in the lecture and the lab. And so I'm looking for ideas how to do that without overwhelming them, because I love ecology. And I have right now several students who also do, although they're not going into a biology major. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I'm at a community college, so a lot of different maybe commitments to studying hard and ability to do that. Right.
Well, I tell you one thing that I did last spring, Anne, was I have a couple students in my lab, and when COVID hit, they couldn't go out in the field in the urban area around campus. They went home. And so what we did was we switched, and they started using satellite imagery to look at the prevalence of trees in different areas. In fact, when I started talking about the trees, the data that they pulled out from the satellite imagery was just great, and from Google Earth. And then some of them went and looked at Google and looked at the streets and Street View to look at the gardens along the streets, because you can almost drive along the streets in virtual space with Google Maps. So between Google Maps and Google Earth, they can do a lot of that kind of ecological observation, and actually collect data, even when they're not in your classroom and not going out into the field.
I think that's really powerful, because a lot of the data mining we do sometimes is done remotely, right? We can go online and get different data sets and work with that. Right. So maybe that's really powerful. Thank you. That's good ideas.
Thank you. And we also have some great suggestions from Christina Colon in the chat. I use iNaturalist with my course. It's a great way to look at distributions of species. She also suggested Zooniverse and the National Phenology Network. I also posted in the chat the virtualfield.org, which has videos that you can use to introduce your class to a new ecosystem and have them make observations on those ecosystems, and they also provide some in the field, live from the field activities with scientists as well, to take your class into the field with a researcher. So lots of suggestions for online learning, which is great if you have, in this situation as well, or if you have large classes and you're not able to take everyone into the field, well, maybe you can do so virtually.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, so another topic that came up was looking at the human environment dimension. So this is a great one that comes up often. How do we connect? So the practices a lot of us are familiar with for ecology, as well as the concepts, but what seems to pose a challenge to some, including myself, is how and to what degree do we incorporate these human dimensions? So the ideas of ethics, environmental ethics, social justice, environmental justice, as was mentioned in the chat, are some of the areas where we're looking to learn more from researchers who explore those areas, as well as educators who are in the social sciences, who look at similar environmental problems, but from a different lens. So how can we bring those perspectives into a classroom? So has anybody used these perspectives, such as social justice and or other lenses, to bring the human dimension into your ecology course? And if so, could you share your experience with us and or any challenges that you faced? So in the chat, okay. So it seems like by the silence, maybe this is one of the areas that is a little bit more difficult for all of us. So let's talk about the challenges. If you haven't yet brought these into your course, why might that be a case, or what might you need to support that shift in your instruction? And how can we support that?
Have any of you done work with your students in urban areas around campus, for instance? I know it's a Friday afternoon. It's been a long week, and I know, but really, you're teachers. You guys are used to talking, please.
I'm practicing my 10-second wait time. It's yeah, so we have a couple yeses, and Leanne, would you like to share? Your hand is raised.
Sure. I find that students really engage much more in the material when they're able to connect some of their broader interests or the real concern for impacts on society. So I find that making those connections for them so they see how ecology and the concepts apply to the human dimensions around them and in the campus really helps. We have a sustainability institute at the University of Dayton, so there's a lot of interdisciplinary work that we do, and we are an urban campus. The students actually who graduated have started an urban farm, so that's another place where they actually going and applying, seeing how ecology is lived out in terms of that urban farm that's providing food for an urban desert. So using those examples, they are very inspired by that kind of engagement of other young adults in those concerns.
Thanks, Leanne. And so we have your example, and Mary Beth also would like to share, so I'll let you chime in, Mary Beth.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, I'll just throw out there this in general. So I'm in the Environmental Studies and Sciences department. So I teach ecology there, conservation biology, and a non-majors ecology, among other courses. And one thing beyond the classroom, I advise the environmental club. And so I've been slowly building over the years the students engaging with non-majors in many different ways. So we've gotten through I've just done a variety of different, through my ConBio class in particular, I've had them working on campus, and we read this book, Win-Win Ecology, that talks about how there's not enough natural, unhuman touched places in the world to preserve biological diversity. So we need to be able to address the needs of biodiversity in places where people live and work. And so our suburban college campus is a really great example of that. And so we've been kind of building on that over the years in terms of both documenting what type of biological diversity species we have on campus, and then also working to inform and engage the students and other Siena community members in that. So we've continued to build things like we'll give like the students will do invasive species walks that we get, or introducing like the Seek apps, or different educational walks on campus and things like that. We're doing slides, so species of the week slides that I had students working on, and they've been doing this through Instagram, and people guess, they get clues throughout the week. So we're just trying a variety of different methods of trying to build up the awareness and the understanding. So outside the classroom, I know this discussion is talking about the 4DEE criteria in the classroom, but I think there's a lot of ways to continue to build and broaden that impact more than just and since, we've got a liberal arts college, we've got a lot of students that have a lot of different expertise. So it fits in really well with the our cross-cutting themes, relationships with the environment, et cetera. So I think it's just fits real natural.
Thanks, Mary Beth. That's great. Jillian Decker in the chat mentions, and I'm going to ask her to speak, so I'm just giving Jillian, I'm giving you a heads up here. Mentions that she's developing a course that focuses on service learning related to community projects. And Jillian, can you talk a little bit about your community engagement? Because I think that's a really, really interesting opportunity to get that human dimension really built in, depending on the kinds of interactions that you have with the community and the service learning. Are you?
Right, so thanks. So we were working with one of the other community colleges in the area. That community college is located in Queens in New York, and we're located in Rockland County. And so obviously different environments. And so we connected with a local watershed group. I have a lot of background in watershed work myself. And so we discussed ideas with them, and I started it off by letting the students direct what they were interested in, and they really connected with this concept of treeside planting by streams as the production of buffer zones. And so we are working to develop that project, and they've had a lot of enthusiasm towards it, and it's been really refreshing to see. And so we want to make this more than just, kind of a temporary project. And so we're going to actually solidify it and put it into an actual course. The fall semester, they'll work on just learning the information, and that will include, science communication, environmental justice, the ecological concepts. And then in the spring, they'll actually go out and conduct their field work. And so we're in the early stages of that development, but part of that will be working along with, community volunteers, tree plantings, and the students have connected with the aspect of it that they're going to actually be benefiting, local communities.
Jillian, do you see differences between the Rockville and Queens communities in terms of their interaction with the students and the projects? Are there community differences there that factor in and affect anything?
For sure, yeah. And this is, like I said, a newer project, so I'm trying to remember. I believe that the LaGuardia Community College is the other college. I believe they are also doing a stream project, but the streams there are going to have, different issues than the streams up by us.
Right.
For sure.
Have you, just out of curiosity, have you run into Russell Burke at Hofstra and his turtle work in that region?
No, I have not.
You might want to check him out. He's doing some
Okay.
very cool work. The
Okay.
turtles get out on the landing strip and the planes can't land because some of them are endangered. It's very interesting.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jillian. That was a great example of how we can incorporate multiple dimensions. You mentioned the service learning component, which incorporates the human dimension. But whilst I was listening to you, I was sort of thinking, yeah, you're getting in those ecology concepts as well as the practices in the fieldwork. So this is a really good multidimensional approach that makes a great example for 4DE. So thanks for sharing. In the chat, Melinda wrote a little bit about how you could use 4DEE to approach students or to present students with different angles that they may be interested in. So for example, therefore, it's not all about cold and objective science. It's more about coming at it from maybe their perspective, philosophy, ethics, field research, policy, outreach, for example. And that really, Melinda, would you like to say anything more about that approach?
Yeah, so when I was teaching, most of the students were non-majors. They weren't even closely related to science. But as I've been learning more about interdisciplinary research later on, now I've stopped teaching, I realized that in teaching that class, I tried to talk about the human dimension, but because I didn't follow some kind of specific framework, it was kind of a missed opportunity. I was mostly talking about the science behind everything. So now I'm realizing that when you think about ecology, we are, as ecologists, maybe are more knowledgeable that like there are different dimensions. You can go into policy and those things I listed, but to a student who's not familiar and coming into ecology, they might just think it's like any other science. So that's been kind of what I've thought about recently.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, my first attempt at 4DEE implementation was in a non-majors classroom. So I had the students vote on what issue, if it was climate change or loss of diversity and so forth that they were interested in, and then try to build the lesson around their interests. So that really rings true for me too. Raymond has his hand up, so we'll love to hear from you, Raymond.
Okay, well, one thing that I've been doing for 20 years now is essentially trying to teach courses that allow students to understand an indigenous perspective of what ecology is and what science is. And it's been, the responses I've gotten from this have been amazing. The students, even people who are majoring in molecular biology or, you know, other fields that you wouldn't think would be interested in it, find themselves incredibly drawn to the idea of the importance of connections and relatedness, which are at root the way we understand ecology. And at the same time, one of the things that I found that this is particularly powerful for is that students can talk about their spiritual beliefs, because with Native people, ecology gets linked to spiritual beliefs or environment or understanding connectedness among species. So as a consequence, others, when I have Native students talking about that in the class, other students then start talking about their spiritual beliefs, and we end up with some really interesting discussions of ethics and attitudes towards environments and all sorts of things, so that we sort of automatically break down all these barriers that you guys are talking about without even ever formally saying so. And you know, I actually have a book on this topic, which is available for free if anybody wants to email me at my email, which is Parati, my last name, at ku.edu, and I can send you a copy of it. And we sort of explore all sorts of topics, population biology, conservation biology. One issue that always gets students' attention is the issue of conservation refugees, which I don't know if I haven't heard anybody mention that, but that turns out to be a really key issue because, yeah, and I teach that as part of my course on environmental justice, because basically what you're looking at there is a conflict between groups that students are inclined to sympathize with, like the bingos, the big international non-governmental organizations like World Wildlife or Nature Conservancy. And yet in many cases, those turn out to be the problems because they are trying to remove indigenous people from their lands on the assumption that humans should not be part of an area where biodiversity is being conserved. And basically, I try to teach my students that exactly the opposite needs to be considered. So that's sort of a basic framework, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you about that in greater detail later. I don't want to try to dominate things, but you know, this is a huge area which I've had incredible success from my own perspective. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Ray. That brings up a really interesting point. But before I get to that, would you be so kind as to put your email address in the chat box so that people can get in touch with you? Thanks.
Of course.
What Ray's brought up is a very interesting piece of that human dimensions and working with it. And that is what I call the stakeholder position. So having students identify various stakeholders in conservation or restoration or ecological or public policy. And oftentimes in some of my classes, I have them role act stakeholder positions and interact in coming up with some sort of public policy. And so by having them take different positions and essentially argue from perspectives that aren't their own, I think it creates a better understanding of some of the difficulties in achieving public policy decisions. And certainly it gives them a perspective that I think they can then carry out into the rest of their life, because in fact, they will be participating in one way, shape, or form in policy decisions, and they need to understand how those discussions work and why people have different perspectives. So that's been a very useful piece. And thank you, Ray, for bringing that up, that different perspectives.
I'd like to second that, because it's often difficult for us to necessarily create the environments where students can talk about these issues, especially in a science class, because usually we think of science like, I believe it was Melody who said it earlier, like as being very cold or sterile. And it humanizes the science to have students talk about who is impacted, who are the stakeholders, but also who are the persons who are the decision makers, and how do you get to influence the decisions that are made based on the science. So I think it's a great way to integrate all of these concepts as well as, you know, the practices and also the ecological concepts, to get students to think of ecology as something that happens, or is not happens, but is part of everyday life and not just something from the classroom. And I think that's what Leanne was sharing, where she said that, you know, ecology, she's hoping 4DEE is not just for the classroom. And we can see from the examples that we are really talking about having students talk about what's happening in the real world. So it might take place in the classroom, but it definitely seeks to connect students with persons outside of the immediate classroom, either by directly working with them, like in service learning, or at least learning and investigating their perspectives. So Martha shared what she's doing in her course. So Martha, do you want to tell us a little bit more?
Sure, I can. Here, I'm trying to show my actual face. Ooh, now I can see that my hair's all a mess. Yeah, I feel like I've been much more successful at bringing in some of that human dimension in my non-majors classes, maybe because I'm less concerned about getting all of that ecology content in there. So I feel like I've got to do a better balance of that with my majors courses. But I do a non-majors one called Race, Class, Gender in the Environment. And that's been really freeing to do that. And one of the things I mentioned, there's a number of essays that I've used out of a text called the Environmental Justice Reader. And there's a little more to the title to that. It's Politics, Poetics, and Pedagogy. And I put the authors in the chat there. But I have found it really, like there's one chapter that's about the cancer rates in this certain area of Alaska where there was some nuclear testing done, and the indigenous people who live in that area are convinced that, you know, they know that something's going on, but they can't get the health department or the US government or whatever to do anything about it, because none of the cancer rate, well, first of all, they say, well, you also do a lot of smoking, so it must be that. So there's, you know, issues in that way, but then also that the cancer, there's not a statistically significant enough difference. And so it's a really good one to talk about whose knowledge is valued, the communities versus, say, the public health or the companies or whatever who have their studies. And then also that idea of, well, what does it mean if a result is not statistically significant? And that in a lot of cases, the sample size in a small village in this rural area is not going to be big enough for there to be, you know, you would have to have a huge impact for it to be statistically significant. So it just brings up a lot of good things about science as a way of knowing and how we do preference certain views. And then there's some other things, you know, there's a good chapter on cancer and gender. And then I've done, you know, I've also brought up conservation refugees, or I always talk about climate change as an environmental justice issue. So that's just a couple of the things that I've been trying to do. Yeah, I could share the syllabus.
Thank you. That
Yes.
sounds it sounds fascinating. I had a note. Where was it? Has anyone constructed a class, a non-majors or even a majors class around making policy? Just out of curiosity. You know, around some controversy that's an environmental controversy that's, you know, in and or around your area, near your university or college, and that you've had the students go out and collect data to address. Has anyone done that? I asked because I've been thinking about it and it sounds really difficult, but I just wondered if I'd love some tips myself.
It sounds like a great idea, but almost sounds a little dangerous if the controversy is very controversial.
It could be, I guess. But I guess if you have tenure, maybe it's not so controversial. I don't know.
Good point.
So when we asked earlier, asked about your interests, and we talked about non-majors, implementation. We talked a little bit about linking it to different human dimension issues. and a little bit about working online. But one other thing that came up in your responses in the chat was talking about assessment. So I would like to ask you guys, how are you assessing for DE? Oh, Raymond, do you have you have your hand up?
Yes, but I didn't want to interrupt you while you were talking or anything, but
No, please
yeah,
go
I mean,
ahead.
we had a big problem here in Lawrence, Kansas that when it lasted for 15 years about the city wanted to build a traffic way through a wetland that was adjacent to our local tribal university. And the tribal university students and the local environmentalists were suing and trying to block the construction of this traffic way, and it ended up involving everybody: the governor, the state senators, congressmen. Everybody got involved in it, and there were threats towards the tribal college and all sorts of things. So, but we stepped into that directly and spent a lot of time working. In fact, when I originally taught my course on Native and Western views of nature, I taught it at the tribal university, and it was offered for credit on at both the tribal university and the University of Kansas, so that we got students from both institutions interacting together, which gave us a really good start to this type of approach.
Terrific. That sounds terrific.
So any other, so George, I of two minds. We only have a few minutes. So I don't know if we just put a teaser that there will be in March or April a 4DEE on assessment, so we can talk a lot about assessment then. And maybe we have some other questions or challenges that folks have faced that they might want to talk about. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay, so for those of you who did raise your hand that you've heard about 4DEE, but you haven't yet used it, we'd love to hear about the challenges that you're facing and how your experience has been so far.
Zakia, please.
I guess I'll share, because I have a really large course between 200 and 300 students. It's often difficult to assess them on, I don't know the right terminology, be more than a multiple choice level, right? Giving them any open-ended questions or anything like that. So I was curious what people have done other than hired 1,000 TAs to help with those type assessments. And if they have figured out how to do that with multiple choice questions, if they would be willing to share some of those questions.
Great question, Zakia, and I will see if anybody wants to chime in. How do you assess with either multiple choice or other methods for large tests?
I guess everybody else struggles. We can keep moving.
No, okay, so I will say that for me, I have a 200-person non-majors class, and for what I do is not try to change it all at once. So change a couple of the questions to be multidimensional each semester, which means one day I will get to have a mostly multidimensional assessment, but not changing it all at once. And there's some other initiatives that are around, such as the Ask Biology program, that are working towards developing multidimensional assessments and sharing them with educators. So I think between 4DEE and these other projects, there's a slowly moving shift towards changing how our assessments, along with the 3D Lab group. So yes, small bites, digestible bites, so that we can talk and share it with others as we do.
Diane Ebert May said many years ago, when she was trying to get everybody to convert to active learning approaches, that the way to do it is not to jump in and think you're going to do it all at once and just add one little bit in one course or add one little bit in one lecture. And then over a period of 2 or 3 years, you'll find that you've transformed the course. And I think that's really the key here. Add just a dimension, add a single dimension somewhere in one of your lectures, bring that human dimension in, or bring the a practices dimension and show the students how it all works. And then as they get comfortable and as you get comfortable doing that, then add another dimension, the following year. And because trying to revamp a whole course all at once, that's really, really hard. So make it gradual, but give yourself a goal of, transforming that course over a 3-4 year period. And I do have to say the other thing that Diane always said, and that is be prepared for pushback. Students don't always like things that are different, and sometimes they push back and give you a hard time, and that's okay, because that suggests that you're really forcing them to rethink what they're doing and to think in new and novel ways. They're not just memorizing the material. And so it's the pushback can be a really great indicator that you're doing a good job. Words of wisdom, and I hope that it might help. Well, we've got about 2 minutes left. And I'd love to, thank you, Jessica. Jessica wants to remind us of future water cooler events.
No, I'm sorry. The slide jumped when I went into presenter mode. Yeah, we only have 2 minutes left. So I was gonna, do we have any last minute lingering questions that we want to address?
Ray just raised his hand.
Oh, did he?
Yep.
Okay, Ray, go for it.
Well, I wanted to endorse what George just said. And one of the problems I've had in some of my classes, especially in a red state, is that if you start introducing some of this stuff, I've had students claim that I teach nothing but Native American material, even though it's never more than maybe 15 to 20% of the course. And so you can run into this sort of thing, and there will be pushback, usually from the students, but also sometimes from your colleagues.
Yeah.
Thanks for the comment, Ray. And I want to thank Luanna and George for taking the time to do this water cooler chat. We do intend to have a 4DEE water cooler chat series this spring, so be on the lookout. We should have probably 2 or 3 more chats coming up, each with a different focus. And as always, we love to hear more information about what you're doing with 4DEE, where you're going, what your questions are. Feel free to visit our website and reach out to us. Great. George, Luanna?
Yeah, thanks all of you. And I really appreciate the fact that you're here. And if you have questions, please feel free to write to Luanna. No, or to me.
Yeah, yeah, we love to hear from you. Thanks, George. And we look out for an email from us because, like Ray suggested, you might need a community to help you do this. And we're trying to build that community. So look out for an invitation from us to join a working group and participate in the community.
Thanks.